Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Sofiane Bouarouj from the Department of Mathematics at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I am so pleased to be with you tonight to introduce our guest speaker, Francesco Calogero. Calogero is a professor emeritus of theoretical physics at University of Roma in Italy. He wrote over 400 scientific papers and 4 books on theoretical and mathematical physics, mainly on integrable systems. He has also published articles on topics related to science and society, mainly on arms control and disarmament. Calogero served as Secretary General of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs between 1989 to 1997. In that capacity, he accepted in 1995 the Nobel Prize awarded to Pugwash and Joseph Rotblat for their efforts to diminish the part played by nuclear arms in international politics and in the longer run to eliminate such arms. Here I am quoting the Nobel Foundation. Tonight, Professor Calogero will give us a talk on a world free of nuclear weapons, desirable, feasible. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Francesco Calogero.
Sofiane. Good evening, and I will go immediately into the talk. Of course, I'm very glad to be here, and I want to thank the university, your provost, who is here, for inviting me. And I gave 2 days ago a scientific talk at the math department, and I'm very glad to have a chance to talk to a more general audience on a general topic. So this is the synopsis of what I will be talking about. I suppose you read it already, so I immediately go into the matter. And so the first topic I will cover very briefly is the special character of nuclear weaponry, why they're really different. And I just give 3 indicators. The first is that the yield of nuclear bombs, I mean the so-called A-bombs, and especially thermonuclear weapons, the H-bomb, the explosions are many orders of magnitudes larger than that of conventional explosions. For instance, the largest thermonuclear test explosion, which was detonated on October 30, 1961 in the high atmosphere by the Soviet Union, released in a fraction of a second an energy well over 50 megatons. And this means more than the energy released by the explosion of 50 million tons, so 50 billion kilograms of conventional explosives, such as TNT. Perhaps more significant, this was more than 10 times larger than the estimated total of all previous explosions in war throughout history, including the 2 world wars with all their carpet bombings, London, Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. So you see, it's really an enormous change, what scientists say, order of magnitude, many orders of magnitude. The second indicator of the particularity, specialty of nuclear weapons is the fact that they've never used in war after they used to obliterate Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 6 and 9 August 1945. Not even when nuclear weapon countries with nuclear weapons, were defeated by a non-nuclear weapon opponent, as the United States in Vietnam and Russia in Afghanistan. And the third indicator of the great difference is all countries of the world except a few, and the few are the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. All the other countries of the world have voluntarily renounced the acquisition of nuclear weaponry by becoming non-nuclear weapon parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and many of these countries also enough to cover more than half of the Earth, including the entire southern hemisphere, becoming party to a nuclear weapon-free zone. And this includes many countries having the technological capability to manufacture nuclear weapons. So these are the 3 indicators of the great change. Then, second topic, desirability and feasibility of the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world. The desirability is far from obvious. In a world of nation-states in which only very few of them possess nuclear weapons, it seems clear that it is preferable for them to keep these capabilities. In a world in which some states have a pariah connotation, possibly for very good reasons, for instance, because of a dismal human rights record, their rulers might feel that the possession of a nuclear weapon capability provides an essential insurance against external interventions. A country that faces an enemy having superior conventional forces may feel that the possession of a nuclear capability is an equalizer. A country encircled by several hostile neighbors that challenge its very right to exist may feel that the possession of a nuclear weapon capability is the ultimate guarantor of survival. And some thinkers argue that the existence of nuclear weapons, by making war exceedingly destructive, provides an indispensable ingredient to avoid major wars, hence it is a guarantor of peace. On the other hand, it is obvious that the spread of nuclear weaponry to many countries, and possibly even to subnational terrorist groups, entails sooner or later their actual use, with devastating consequences for our civilization, possibly even the disappearance of Homo sapiens. And it is indeed well known from worldwide opinion polls, to the extent that these tests are reliable, that the significant majority of the inhabitants of this planet favor the total elimination of nuclear weaponry, including significant majorities in most, perhaps all, the countries now possessing nuclear weapons. It is also remarkable that so many states have so far voluntarily renounced the acquisition of nuclear weapons, including quite a few states having the technical capability to acquire them. But this regime of nuclear weapon non-proliferation cannot last indefinitely. It is now in danger of crumbling. So I gave you some arguments why many may think that it is desirable to keep nuclear weapons, and some arguments on the other side of the question. The feasibility is, in my opinion, instead rather clear, easy. Nuclear weapons have not been used in war after August 9, 1945. There probably is no person in this room who was an adult at that time. I myself was 10 years old in 1945, so I'm very old. The total elimination of chemical weaponry as a usable military instrument has now been essentially achieved by treaty, and note that these weapons were used much more often in war than nuclear weapons, and that the verification of the universal respect of their abolition is much more cumbersome than it shall be for nuclear weapons, due to the much more extended and pervasive character of chemical rather than nuclear peaceful activities. Moreover, and then I repeat this, as a teacher, I believe that sometimes repetita juvent. Moreover, all countries of the world except 8 or 9 have already voluntarily renounced nuclear weapons by having become full parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in addition, many of them having become full parties to nuclear weapon-free zone, which cover a large part of our planet, including the totality of the Southern Hemisphere. And these treaties have efficient verification regimes. Now, I very briefly mention past activities promoting nuclear disarmament and the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world. And this is, I say it explicitly, a somewhat parochial selection. In fact, I will just mention 3 instances. One is a book, which was a collection of articles, a book called Verification, Monitoring, Disarmament, which was published in 1989 in the United States in English, and in 1990 in Russian in Moscow. And this was the first book on a strategically very sensitive topic. Verification was a great bone of contention throughout the Cold War, all chapters of which were co-signed by authors on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. This, of course, became possible after Gorbachev came to power in Russia and the great change from the Soviet Union to Russia. The second instance is A Nuclear Weapon-Free World, Desirable, Feasible, a book with just the same title as this lecture, again a Pugwash monograph, and published in 1993. I had a contribution in that book. And then, as already mentioned, the Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award, this is just a quotation, to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 1995 in 2 equal parts to Joseph Rotblat and to the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs for their efforts to diminish the part played by nuclear arms in international politics and, in the longer run, to eliminate such arms. This was the official quotation, and this was the Nobel ceremony. The man on the right is Joseph Rotblat. Now, the title of this section is The Transition to a Nuclear Weapon-Free World, from Desirable Utopia to Political Reality. And I say that this transition occurred on one specific day. And this specific day was January 4, 2007, when an op-ed appeared in the Wall Street Journal, by the way, a journal not particularly known for being very liberal, and rather conservative in nature. And it was entitled, A World Without Nuclear Weapons. And I interpret it as the coming out in favor of the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world by a bipartisan quartet of eminent American statesmen. George Shultz, Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn. I just quote the final sentence. It says, we endorse setting the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons and working energetically on the actions required to achieve that goal, beginning with the measures outlined above. The measures are outlined in the body of this paper. Of course, they don't say do it tomorrow. They say they give. But it's a commitment to identify this as a goal and as a desirable goal. And these 4 people, the importance of this article is in the 4 people who signed it, which are Shultz was the Secretary of State from 82 to 89 of President Reagan. Perry was the Secretary of Defense from 94 to 97 for President Clinton. Kissinger was Secretary of State from 73 to 77 with President Nixon. And Nunn is the former chairman for very many years of the United States Senate Army Service Committee, so the committee of the Senate of the United States in charge of military affairs. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. And this bipartisan op-ed is very significant because of its authors, but even more so because of the avalanche of subsequent endorsement all over the world. For instance, in the United States, by the majority of the living Americans having served as Secretaries of State, Secretaries of Defense, and Special Assistants for International Security to the President. And in the rest of the world, by an impressive array of eminent personalities. Too many to be reported. I think the first were a group of British. Very often it was the same pattern was kept, having 4 people signing, 2, so to say, from the left and 2 from the right. I just quote here the one in Italy, which was published in the main Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera, and about 1 year later, the title was For a World Without Nuclear Weapons. This part is in Italian, but I just read the last sentence. It says, the diffusion of a new way of thinking, of a new shared wisdom is a fundamental step in this direction to which also Italy must contribute. It is necessary that on these themes, fundamental for the very survival of humankind, in spite of legitimate, indeed necessary political contrapositions, a superior common interest be recognized. Just saying that they are in favor of going ahead. Again, the importance is not so much in the words, but in the quality of the people, which are indicated here. Massimo D'Alema is the former prime minister and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs. As you see, in very recent times, I mean, the article was in 2008, and these were actual active politicians. Gianfranco Fini, who was a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and was then Chairman of Parliament, in fact, until December 2012. Giorgio Lamalfa, former Minister of European Affairs, and Arturo Parisi, former Minister of Defense. And then I signed sort of as a representative of the general society. Again, there were two from center-left at the time and two from center-right. Over time, the situation of the politician has a little bit changed, but this is the way it was. The most important, however, of this avalanche of speeches was a speech by President Obama in 5 April 2009, as president, not as former president. And this part I don't read, it's too detailed, but I just read this statement. He said, "So today, as I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. I am not naive. This goal will not be reached quickly, perhaps not in my lifetime. It will take patience and persistence. But now we too must ignore the voices who tell us that the world cannot change. We have to insist, yes, we can." And maybe some of you, those who are not so young, may remember that yes, we can was the slogan of Obama in his first successful run for the presidency. And I have a second quote by Obama, which is 3 years later, in March 26, in a university in Korea now, 2012, and he said, "Now, American leadership has been essential to progress in a second area, taking concrete steps towards a world without nuclear weapons. As a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, this is our obligation, and it's one that I take very seriously. But I believe the United States has a unique responsibility to act. Indeed, we have a moral obligation. I say this as president of the only nation ever to use nuclear weapons. I say it as a commander-in-chief who knows that our nuclear codes are never far from my side. Most of all, I say it as a father who wants my 2 young daughters to grow up in a world where everything they know and love can't be instantly wiped out." These are strong words, and behind them there is evidently a very strong commitment and conviction. All this advocacy is mainly based on 4 arguments. 1, the end of the Cold War. 2, the intrinsic risk of the existence of nuclear weapons, the actual use of which has been avoided so far due to responsible caution, but also thanks to good luck. And I advise you to read the book by Erich Schlösser, published 4 years ago. It's called Command and Control. I think it is now, they made also a film out of it, which is, I think, available for free on the internet. It's a very, very impressive book and also very easy to read. If you begin, you won't let it down until you finish it. Third argument, the risk of a breakdown of the worldwide nuclear weapon non-proliferation regime, leading to the spread of nuclear weapons to more countries and more probably to their actual use with horrendous consequences. And finally, the need of a common approach to fight, namely to prevent terrorism, including, I would like to emphasize, nuclear terrorism. And I will say a few words about this topic. Nuclear terrorism, the risk of nuclear terrorism, the possibility that a sub-state group acquire the capability to engineer a nuclear explosion. So a few specific points. The explosion of a primitive Hiroshima-type nuclear device in a major city would be a sudden catastrophe comparable, perhaps worse, than any tragic event in human history. There exist terrorist groups who would cause such a disaster if they could. A primitive nuclear explosive device could be easily manufactured clandestinely in a target city by a small terrorist commando if they could get hold of a sufficient quantity of weapon-grade, highly enriched uranium, and possibly also with weapon-grade plutonium, although this task is less easy. 100 kilograms of weapon-grade, highly enriched uranium would be more than enough. As a consequence of the enormous accumulation of weapon-grade, highly enriched uranium during the Cold War, and in spite of a significant elimination of this material during the last 1, 2, 3 decades by downblending it to low-enriched uranium, then used in nuclear reactors to produce electrical energy, in spite of this, there still are more than 1 million kilograms of highly enriched uranium around, most of it in Russia, comparable quantities also in the United States, and smaller quantities, but still significantly larger than 100 kilograms in other countries. This material is, of course, not available for sale and is, in principle, well protected, but not necessarily all of it in real practice, although the situation has improved over the last years, or maybe decades, especially in Russia, both due to the improvement of the economic situation there and thanks to outside collaborative interventions, mainly by the United States. I consider still quite imminent the risk that a city be destroyed by a nuclear explosion engineered by a terroristic commando. Hence, I believe that more effort should be made to protect all the existing highly enriched uranium, to terminate all its civilian employments by converting all research and naval reactors still employing highly enriched uranium to using instead the compact low-enriched uranium now available as a viable alternative, and especially to eliminate by downblending as much highly enriched uranium as possible as quickly as possible. The most important step in this direction would have been an extension, hopefully envisaging a faster pace, of the highly enriched uranium deal among the United States and Russia, whose implementation has been recently completed after having eliminated 500 tons, so a very large quantity, 500,000 kilograms of highly enriched uranium over a period of 20 years. But this hope does not seem likely to materialize, and namely the hope that this type of agreement be continued or renovated. Positive developments on the worldwide protection of nuclear materials are now an accepted priority of the international community, as for instance shown by these recent summit meetings convened at the highest level by the Obama administration in Washington in 2010, in Seoul 2012, in The Hague 2014, and the last one in Washington in 2016. The Obama administration has taken this task much more seriously than it was previously done. But I still believe that more could and should be done. And let me emphasize that the complete elimination of highly enriched uranium is quite compatible with the continuation of the utilization of nuclear energy, which can be done with low enriched uranium, not highly enriched uranium. If you ask, I can explain the difference. So I now mention quickly some positive developments in the progress towards a nuclear weapon-free world. One is the New START agreement between the United States and Russia, signed in April 2010 and entered into force in February 2011. And it was a further reduction of the two nuclear arsenals of the United States and Russia, of course, with proper joint verification. Then there were these summits, which I already mentioned, to take care of the fissile materials throughout the world. May 2010, there was a progress, significant progress in transparency by the United States. It was a complete disclosure of the United States nuclear arsenal. The data was actually known, but this was the first time that they were officially made known, and especially of the new nuclear posture review, which restricted the circumstances of possible employment of nuclear weapons, stating that the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is to deter an attack performed with nuclear weapons. It did not go as far as saying that the sole role of nuclear weapons is to deter an attack performed with nuclear weapons, but certainly it was a step forward. With respect to the previous posture review, which however was classified, but it was more or less known what it was stating. May 2010, then there was the quinquennial NPT review conference. The Non-Proliferation Treaty envisages every 5 years a review conference, not to change the treaty, but to see what the status of the treaty is. It ended in May 2010 with a unanimous statement. The previous one, in May 2005, had ended in disarray, in my opinion, largely because of the arrogant attitude of the Bush administration, in power at the time, while the non-nuclear weapon states were severely urged not to proliferate. No progress in nuclear disarmament by the nuclear weapon state was envisaged. You know, the Non-Proliferation Treaty has this distinction between the countries that are recognized as nuclear weapon countries, which are 5, and all the other countries of the world, with the commitment by the other countries not to acquire nuclear weapons, and the commitment by the 5 to make progress in nuclear disarmament, but without any fixed deadline. On the contrary, however, the quinquennial NPT review conference of 2015 did not manage to issue an agreed final statement. So an indication of a deterioration of the situation, the unhappiness of the non-nuclear weapon parties of the Non-Proliferation Treaty with the lack of progress towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. I indicate a few recent hopeful developments, but as I say, possibly indicating the wishful thinking of myself. One is the improvement of the relations between the United States and Russia, including the prospect of joint development of anti-ballistic missile capabilities. This was, however, some time ago, and unfortunately these issues are open, and the recent crisis with Ukraine and over the war in Syria has seriously damaged the relationship between the United States and Russia. A postponement by the government in the United Kingdom, the new government, the conservative liberal present government, of the decision to develop a new generation of Trident submarine, which are the British nuclear weapon carriers. But again, it seems that the United Kingdom is actually going ahead with this development. Perhaps a new resolve by China in its own interest to push North Korea to abandon their nuclear weapon program, leading to a nuclear weapon-free Korean peninsula and the formal end of the Korean conflict. But this issue is quite open. Indeed, North Korea continues to pursue its nuclear weapon development, with experimental nuclear explosion of increasing yield, and also its development of long-range missiles. The Iranian agreement, which I consider an important element of the worldwide nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime, strong commitment by several governments worldwide, including key states such as Germany and Japan, and of course of the United Nations, to progress towards a nuclear weapon-free world, but also jeopardized by the Ukrainian crisis and the nuclear weapon developments in North Korea. And then I mentioned the creation of a European leadership network for multilateral nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. The acronym is ELN, mainly composed of eminent personalities, top politicians, former highest-ranking military commanders. The original convener is Lord Desmond Brown, which was a former Minister of Defense, Labour in Great Britain, which is a group of people committed to work towards a nuclear weapon-free world. And if you are interested, you can look at their website, or our website. Then I mentioned future steps towards a nuclear weapon-free world. An essential one, in my opinion, is the reset of relations among the United States and Russia. From conflict to partnerships, there was a key formula which was invented by Prime Minister of Sweden many, many years ago, was common security. And of course, the involvement of China also. Further progress in nuclear disarmament, and this could be bilateral United States-Russia agreements, and the various issues are strategic nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, the warheads instead of delivery vehicles as the focus of the reductions, issue of space, and then the issue of conventional weapons. The involvement of all the nuclear weapon countries, the other nuclear weapon countries, and eventually, and I will say something more about this, a universal convention with adequate verification, perhaps on the model of the chemical weapon conventions, perhaps backed by additional nuclear weapon-free zone, for instance, in the extended Middle East. And then the very notion of what is meant by a nuclear weapon-free world needs perhaps to be more investigated. You can define it as what is called global zero, so no nuclear weapon exists, but then you can also define it with what I use the word asymptotic, which is a word, mathematical term, and that means that you have a situation in which a very long delay, infinite time, is technologically required for any reconstitution of nuclear arsenals. Because there is the argument that you cannot disinvent nuclear weapons, but you can create a situation in the whole world where it would take a very long time to reconstruct nuclear arsenals, and a situation where this situation verified internationally. There are possible unilateral or reciprocal steps which would be welcome and necessary. One is ratification by the United States Senate of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and hopefully subsequent entry into force of this treaty. But unfortunately, it's quite unlikely with the Senate dominated by the Republican Party. Each of these issues we may discuss in the discussion. I mean, it requires a certain knowledge of what is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Comprehensive Test Treaty, incidentally, when it was open to signatures, it was signed by the United States as the first country under President Clinton. But then political situation changed and it has never been ratified by the United States. On the other hand, the formula is such that unless a certain number of countries ratified it, one of which is the United States, the treaty does not enter into force. Another important change would be a nuclear posture change, saying that the sole role of nuclear weapons is to deter an attack with nuclear weapons. Then the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world becomes a logical consequence. Of course, logical consequences, not necessarily are then really implemented as consequences. Another important step would be nuclear strategy, the idea of no first use of nuclear weapons, not being used first. And finally, a very important urgent measure would be the termination of the quick alert of nuclear-armed missiles, which now envisages their launch within minutes, both in the United States and in Russia. And this is a very dangerous posture, still adopted by the United States and Russia. And I have a quote here from Bill Perry, who was Secretary of Defense of the United States from 94 to 97, in which he said, he wrote and said, "I believe that we avoided nuclear catastrophe as much by good luck as by good management." And this situation with the existence of missiles with nuclear weapons on quick alert is now made even more worrisome and dangerous by the development of cyber warfare, the possible interference with the command and control by cyber. A positive development is the establishment of a nuclear fuel bank in Kazakhstan. On August 27, 2015, 2 years ago, the government of Kazakhstan signed an agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency to establish an international low-enriched uranium fuel bank in the country. This bank, to be located in this place, in the northeast city of this place, will be owned and managed by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. It will give members access to enriched nuclear fuel, low-enriched uranium, in cases of disruption of their own supply, thus removing the need for countries to build their own enrichment facilities, which pose a proliferation risk. If a country develops the capability to enrich uranium with the purpose of acquiring low-enriched uranium for their peaceful nuclear energy, then they also have the capability to enrich to to produce highly enriched uranium. It's very easy to extend. You just have to reprocess the same material a little bit more, and then acquiring highly enriched uranium means acquiring capability, easy capability to produce nuclear explosives. The bank has been inaugurated on August 29, 2017 in Astana, so about 5 weeks ago. I happened to be there because it was the last day of the Pugwash conference in Astana, so there was a ceremony. And then the other development, which I consider positive, is the launching and progress of what is called the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons Initiative. It started as an initiative to focus on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And I have here a description, I will read it. The use of nuclear weapons contradicts basic principles of humanitarian international law, such as the principles of proportionality and the non-targeting of civilians. Nuclear weapons are inhuman and out of sync with modern societies that have outlawed all other weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological, as well as weapon systems such as landmines and cluster munitions. For the same reasons, the proponents of this humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons initiative argue that nuclear weapons must also be outlawed. 113 states have already adopted the humanitarian pledge launched by Austria after the third of these conferences in December 2014. The pledge points to the legal gap outlined above, and in the foreseeable future will most likely lead to multilateral negotiations for a prohibition of nuclear weapons, irrespective of the view of the nuclear weapon states. This is a paper by Tom Sawyer. in August of 2 years ago. And this initiative has in fact had a very positive development in the sense that, well, I read here, remarkably, the Humanitarian Pledge Initiative turned out to be supported by a large number of states, although not by the 8 nuclear weapon states. There's 8 states which possess nuclear weapons, which are the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China, members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty as nuclear weapon states. Then 3 states which are outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they never signed it, which are India, Pakistan, and Israel. And then, of course, there is the case of North Korea. So the 8 nuclear weapon states and none of the NATO countries went ahead with this initiative. But the initiative eventually produced the so-called Ban Treaty, which is a treaty that outlaws altogether nuclear weapons, which has been supported by a significant majority of the United Nations membership and which will enter into force after it has been signed and ratified by 50 states. And this has already happened. It has been signed by 53 states already, and others may sign. This happened just very, very recently. And of course, in order to enter into force, it will have to be ratified by all the states. For those, and signed by other states. For those nations that are party to it, the treaty prohibits the development, testing, production, stockpiling, stationing, transfer, use, and threat of use of nuclear weapons, as well as assistance and encouragement to the prohibited activities. For nuclear-armed states joining the treaty, it provides for a time-bound framework for negotiations leading to the verified and irreversible elimination of its nuclear weapons program. And I read here a position statement by the president of Pugwash and the secretary general of Pugwash just, I think, a few days ago. The treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons leading to their elimination will be open for signature on September 20 at the United Nations headquarters, this September 20, so a few days ago. It happened. This instrument was adopted last July by 122 states after intense negotiation. It is obviously consistent with the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and in fact provides a path towards nuclear disarmament and the abolition of nuclear weapons as requested by Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in fulfillment of a long-standing aspiration of the international community. The very first resolution of the General Assembly in 1946, when the United Nations were established in 1946, already called for the elimination of all weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons. The other 2 categories of weapons of mass destruction, biological and chemical, have already been outlawed by multilateral treaties. This time, the time to step up efforts on nuclear disarmament is now. Pugwash calls on all states to take these important steps towards the achievement of peace and security for all nations and peoples by signing the Prohibition Treaty and working for its ratification and early entry into force. So this is the position of Pugwash. I say here, if I ask, I will tell you my own opinion on this development during the question and answer periods. And then a final personal note. It is known that public opinions worldwide favor by significant majorities the transition to a nuclear weapon-free world. But there are some skeptics, especially among the so-called nuclear weapon experts, especially among those with a civilian background who make a living by pontificating on these matters. From these quarters, it is often stated that it is impossible to disinvent nuclear weapons. But many social institutions have been disinvented over time. For instance, the habit to eat enemy prisoners, slavery, in democratic countries, restrictions by social status, land, property, by gender, by race, to the universal right to vote. Chemical weaponry has been eliminated after this weapon had been repeatedly used during the last century. And this entails the verification of the world chemical industry, which is a more daunting task than verifying peaceful nuclear activities in a nuclear weapon-free world. Even war itself has now become unthinkable in certain contexts, such as Western Europe, where the two world wars took place during the last century. So it's an example of disinventing, in fact, war in a context which is, in fact, the context where the two last world wars took place. As previously emphasized, nuclear weapons have been employed in war only twice, 6 and 9 August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They have never been used afterwards, even when states possessing enormous nuclear arsenals were defeated in war by states without nuclear weapons. For instance, the United States in Vietnam and the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. You see, I repeat. This is the first time in human history that something of the kind happened. It is an indication then, in some quite significant sense, we already live in a nuclear weapon-free world. A world where nuclear weapons are de facto, if not yet de jure, unusable. Were it not so, how to explain the fact that by becoming parties to the NPT and possibly in addition to a nuclear weapon-free zone, almost all world states have voluntarily given up the option to acquire a nuclear weapons arsenal, including several states for whom acquiring such a capability would be technologically quite easy. But this consensus is now at risk unless the nuclear weapon countries, and in premise the two bigger ones, the United States and Russia, make progress towards a nuclear weapon-free world. This also shows that a political strategic development considered unfeasible can indeed happen. After the Cuban nuclear missile crisis that brought the world close to a nuclear catastrophe in autumn 1962, President Kennedy and other world leaders pushed strongly for the establishment of a worldwide nuclear weapon non-proliferation regime. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty then was concluded and it entered into force in 1970. But as emphasized by those who opposed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, also in Italy, its success was at that time quite doubtful. Many nuclear weapon pundits predicted that within 1-2 decades, 20-30 states would have acquired nuclear weapons. Indeed, in the 1960s, many states had initiated programs aimed at developing nuclear weapons, and several of them were quite opposed to the NPT. And 2 of the 5 nuclear weapon states, as defined by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, were also strongly opposed to the NPT, the France of de Gaulle and the China of Mao. And there were several, as I said, several other countries were also strongly opposed to it, for instance, Argentina and Brazil, which were beginning local nuclear weapon arms race. Yet, the Non-Proliferation Treaty turned out to be a great success. More than 4 decades later, all countries of the world are full parties except for 3 or 4. India, Pakistan, and Israel, who never signed it and acquired nuclear weapons, and North Korea, who became a party but then opted out. But this large consensus is at risk. The relatively recent, quite significant surge of pronouncement by political leaders worldwide that I mentioned in favor of a transition to a nuclear weapon-free world brings to mind the famous dictum attributed to Victor Hugo: "Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come." This is why I am confident that such a transition is in theory. Obama said in Prague that this goal perhaps will not be reached in his lifetime. I am much older than he is, yet I entertain the hope that it might perhaps be achieved in my lifetime. But perhaps only after some catastrophic nuclear explosion, accidental or engineered by terrorists, or possibly even in a warlike context, and after the widespread revulsion against nuclear weaponry caused in worldwide public opinions by such a major tragedy. Thanks, and I will be happy to reply to questions.
Thank you for your presentation, sir. I had a very specific question. So, you have countries like India and Pakistan, and then the US and North Korea, which I think you could say that they face a prisoner's dilemma, where if either of the two states, for example, in India and Pakistan, if India denuclearizes, then that puts it at a relative advantage to Pakistan. So both these countries have an incentive to always defect and to keep their nuclear weapons, even if the state of the world would be better if both got rid of their nuclear weapons. So, in your opinion, how do we overcome the prisoner's dilemma that exists between the US and North Korea and India and Pakistan?
Well, let's begin from India and Pakistan. The way out is obvious. There has to be an agreement between the two countries, India and Pakistan, to recognize that it is in their major interest to give up nuclear weapons and avoid this great danger associated with nuclear weapons. The difficulty there is that, of course, there is a major unbalance between the two countries, India and Pakistan. India is much larger, it certainly has a much larger conventional capability. Conventional means non-nuclear capability. And therefore, the country that feels inferior conventionally acquires a nuclear capability because that is considered to be an equalizer. So the elimination of the nuclear weapons of India and Pakistan depends, of course, in lessening the conflict between these two countries and recognize that, after all, it is convenient for them to find an accommodation and agree together and with reciprocal verification to eliminate their nuclear weapons. This is not simple. For one reason, for one, India will say that they are not only concerned with Pakistan, but they're concerned with China. And so it is not simple. And of course, there are specific conflicts between the two countries, especially the Kashmir problem. So this is the reason why progress is difficult. But the only way is to progress in this sense, in this direction, by the recognition that the danger of a nuclear war would be catastrophic for both countries. As for the North Korean situation, this is a very complicated situation, and before saying my opinion, I just want to make a statement that most of the things I've said until now are not opinions; they are facts. And facts are facts. I mean, I've given you a lot of facts. Opinions are opinions, and you can agree. I want to emphasize that when I express an opinion, it's much more debatable. I mean, when I tell you about the characteristic of nuclear weapons, these are facts. These are not debatable. North Korea is, in my opinion, an abominable regime, one of the most abominable, if not the most abominable regime. And I mean for the people who live in North Korea. So, in my opinion, it would be most desirable that that regime be changed and eliminated. But this is not easy, not feasible, and at the same time, this is the main reason for them to acquire nuclear weapons, so that the regime cannot be eliminated, because they are require the capability to produce enormous damage before being eliminated, especially because the city of Seoul is very close to the border, and it's a city with 20 million inhabitants or even more. So it's a very difficult situation, and in the, so to say, short run, the only question is, the only possibility, it seems to me, is to rely very largely on the involvement of China. Because I think that the solution of that problem is essentially a responsibility. It essentially requires a direct involvement of China. And from this point of view, I see progress. You know, in the past, where there were sanctions to the development in North Korea, when they came to the Security Council, Russia and China voted against, and in fact used the veto so that they could not be implemented with the support of the Security Council, therefore, in some sense, the international community. Now, both Russia and China vote in favor. And therefore, in some sense, North Korea is not pitted against the United States. It's pitted against the entire world community. And in that context, sanctions may become really biting. Because again, their implementations depends primarily on the behavior of China. So that is my hope that eventually China will force a stop to the development of a nuclear capability by North Korea. China, the threat to China is, I think, the threat that North Korea will collapse. And that would be a disaster for China. It would mean millions of North Koreans seeking refuge in China. It would also mean that China would have on its border a state which is in some sense aligned with the United States. So China has some interest in the preservation of North Korea, which is a satellite of China. But up to a point, because I think now China is beginning to become really concerned. So I see the development as more and more of an active role played by China.
Good night, Mr. Calogero. In your opinion, what would be some legal mechanisms that would need to be implemented in order for a potential treaty to be respected by all the nations that sign it?
What is the question is, what is the mechanism to guarantee that the treaty is...
legal mechanisms that ensure that the treaty will be respected?
Well, the first mechanism is, of course, verification. You want, if there is a treaty, you want to have means to verify that the treaty is respected by all those who are committed to the treaty. That is the main point. If somebody then violates the treaty, then of course there are various ways of intervening, and eventually the treaty loses its validity, but then those who violate are subject to countermeasures, which can be, they can be very serious, and so usually treaties with a very serious verification regime are not violated, because the country that signs it knows that they cannot violate it. It's not always so. There has been cases like, for instance, in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and the regime can clandestinely try to violate a treaty. But first of all, usually it cannot go very far in violating the treaty, for instance, trying to acquire nuclear weapons after having signed the non-proliferation treaty. And secondly, the incentive to do so is most of these treaties have a clause that allows countries to go out of the treaty. And so if a country really, or the leaders of a country think that it is not in their interest to abide by the treaty, they can then opt out, and then, of course, the whole international the whole world is involved in this fact. If they try to do this clandestinely and there is an effective verification regime, then they cannot do it. I mean, and there is no world government yet, so there is no enforcement of the international treaties. But nevertheless, international treaties do function, do work. As I said, for instance, chemical weapons have been essentially eliminated. There were enormous arsenals of chemical weapons in the United States and in Russia and in many other countries. A little bit they were used in Syria, but Syria had not signed that treaty. Then almost immediately after, there was instances of chemical weapons being used in that war. Syria signed the treaty and accepted verification, and the arsenals that were there were eliminated, in fact, by the international community. Some of these chemical weapons, maybe a few, have remained, but de facto, chemical weapons have been eliminated. It may be that a little bit used. It's a tragedy when they're used, but they are no more a component of war. So treaty can succeed in eliminating weapons. There are other examples of weapons which are eliminated by treaty, and then everybody, in some sense, every country, once they sign and ratify, they abide by the treaties. So treaties are effective.
Thank you very much, sir, for a very interesting presentation. I'm going to ask a very sort of unheard of question, which is, a few years ago after the Iran deal, having access to Arabic commentators on Twitter from Saudi Arabia, I've seen a lot of them calling for their government to start in the process of acquiring nuclear weapons in the future. Of course, no governmental figure said that or stated that, but a lot of the voices in Saudi Arabia, I've noticed that they have called for that. And unfortunately, I'm not as optimistic as you are when it comes to countries not developing nuclear weapons. Do you see any scenario in the future, even the far future, where Saudi Arabia would pursue nuclear weapons to counteract Iran's influence and Iran's ambitions to acquire them? Do you see any possible scenario that may be in the future, or you don't think so?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that the agreement that has, for the moment, stopped the development of the acquisition of a nuclear weapon capability by Iran is very important. And it is, in my opinion, this is again an opinion, most desirable that it will be maintained. Because as long as it is clear and verified that Iran is making no progress in the direction of acquiring nuclear weapons, the need, if you might say, for other countries, or the desire for other countries in the region to acquire nuclear weapons has much less of a justification. So that is crucial, the fact that the agreement with Iran, which has in a verifiable manner demonstrated that Iran is no more developing the capability of acquiring nuclear weapons, remain in force, continues to be verified by the IAEA, And in such a situation, the justification or the urge for Saudi Arabia to acquire nuclear weapons will be much less. I think it should be much less. And therefore, the justification in front of the world community would be much less. The scenario that some people consider more of a concern is that Pakistan might at some point decide to make an agreement with Saudi Arabia, maybe analogous to the agreement that exists between the United States and certain European countries, so that some nuclear weapons of Pakistan, maybe under Pakistan control, might be deployed in Saudi Arabia. And this is one of the reasons why some people support very strongly this new ban treaty, which bans also the possibility to deploy nuclear weapons in the territory of another country, or let's say any country that accepts the ban treaty also take the commitments not to accept the presence of nuclear weapons not belonging to that country, but belonging to others. So this is a situation, and this is the concern. All these processes are action-reaction processes, and so my hope, and a reasonable hope, is that as long as Iran does not develop or go in the direction of developing nuclear weapons, it is unlikely that Saudi Arabia will take the gamble of making steps in that direction. Always within countries, there are some people then, advocate the acquisition of nuclear weapons, but the important thing is that they should be in the minority. Not have governmental responsibilities.
Nice lecture, Dr. Calogero. My question was that, global warming and climate changes, I think might directly affect the acquirement of nuclear weapons and actually retainment of nuclear weapons. One of the recent articles mentioned that Pakistan and India, if war was to start, Pakistan, and if India was to cut off the water supply, and Pakistan would consider that as a threat to their existence, they might attack with nuclear weapon. So as climate changes happens, as water becomes tighter, many countries might actually acquire nuclear weapons. What do you think about that? How does climate changes will affect nuclear proliferation?
I'm sorry, I don't understand why the problem of climate change.
Because
if there is climate change, that will be bad for many countries of the world, but why acquire nuclear weapons
Because let's say that Pakistan and India, this is like where 1.2 billion people live, and they rely on the water from the Himalayas, and the glaciers are melting. And India has said many times that they might cut the water supply to Pakistan. And Pakistan has answered that basically this will be considered a threat to their existence, and they'll do what needs to be done. So this is what many experts believe, that might actually, if ever was to happen, this might actually trigger a nuclear weapon, nuclear war.
Well, I cannot answer to that. I think that if the answer maybe is to say that one should focus more on trying to prevent climate change. If climate change occurs, then you can argue that if it is extreme in many parts of the world, many people will be starving, dying. They will then kill their neighbors and so on. There will be many, many bad consequences. One of these could be to develop nuclear weapons. I don't see this as a particular danger. I think severe climate change will, of course, be very bad for everybody in the world, for some more, for some less. For very few, it will improve their climate. And the fact that it will make some conflicts more acute, yes, is one of the bad consequences. But then that these conflicts will then be solved by, or will lead to the production of nuclear weapons, yes, maybe one additional negative consequences, but I don't see it as, fortunately, as so imminent.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. Now, my question is again related to this gentleman's question, and it's a two-part question. Number one is related to Pakistan and India. Both are hostile countries. Both have developed nuclear weapons for past 20 years almost now. And both have the policy of no first use. Both are keeping an equivalent...
Okay.
Okay. Both are keeping an equivalent deterrence level of nuclear arms. They don't possess the H-bombs, but yes, they do possess the atomic bombs. My question over here is that how do we tackle the problem of acquiring the parts used in developing a nuclear device? Now that it has been developed, but still, I believe that some parts are still acquired internationally. So how do we put a stop to that part of for both the countries? Because both are hostile countries. That's a very hostile border. There was an article a few years back in the Economist magazine that this is the most hostile border in the world of India and Pakistan. Second question is that Israel not having a documented nuclear test as of now. I'm not sure whether my information is correct on that topic or not. But the need of Israel having a nuclear weapon in that part of the country where other countries are as well equally hostile towards each other as towards Israel. So what's the need of Israel having a nuclear weapon where the surrounding countries or the border shares are not really having any nuclear arsenals over there?
Yeah, well, the first question, you see the situation that was present in Europe, in Western Europe, I'm going a little during the Cold War, when on the other side was the Soviet Union, was the conviction that the Soviet Union was absolutely superior in conventional weapons and that the Soviet tanks could overrun the whole of Europe in a week. I think it was completely false, but that was the prevalent idea. And therefore, that it was necessary to have a nuclear weapon capability with first use in order to stop or then to prevent or to deter this from happening. The same situation is, to some extent, but the same situation is in the relationship between India and Pakistan. It's not correct that Pakistan has a no first use policy. Pakistan has a first use policy. Pakistan says that if there will be a war, and if they will be overrun by the Indians, which they expect to be overrun because the Indians are larger, then they will use nuclear weapons. And in fact, Pakistan is now developing tactical nuclear weapons and fielding them in, not on the border, but using the presence of tactical nuclear weapons. Again, the argument is that this will then deter India. But this is the type of argument that exists between the two countries. And of course, that means that progress in the elimination requires the progress in the elimination of the real contentious matter, in particular Kashmir, and reaching an agreement. As long as there is a very acute interaction, then it's very difficult. But the difficulty there comes on the Pakistani side by feeling inferior, and on the Indian side, to some extent, the fact of not accepting not being a country of first rank, because being one of being perhaps the largest country of the world in terms of population, or the second. And then the second, the China argument. Now, the second question is concerning Israel. Well, at the beginning of my talk, I indicated why certain countries may feel that it is desirable for them to have a nuclear weapon capability. And for Israel, that has a nuclear weapon capability, although it has never been declared officially, but everybody believes and knows that they have that. This is precisely associated with the fact that Israel has many countries around it, some of which don't even recognize the very existence of Israel. And I'm not justifying Israel. In fact, I think that that route may exacerbate the conflict, as you are in some way hinting at. But to some extent, on the other hand, it is understandable. And it is understandable that for public opinion in Israel is very much in favor of keeping that capability, and accepts that this capability, that nobody is allowed to talk about this, because they feel that this is their ultimate survival chance. So again, in order to arrive at the renunciation of nuclear weapons by Israel, I think that the only way will be to have an accommodation in which eventually Israel gets accepted by the countries around it. And to do that, also the policy of Israel, in my opinion, should change with respect to the Palestinians. And it should be an acceptance of a Palestinian state with sure borders and without interference. This is the hopeful future. And at present, unfortunately, in that situation also things are, in my opinion, not developing in a positive way. And I may add one thing, again, very personal opinion. I am a supporter, I've always been a supporter of Israel for many reasons. A main reason being, of course, the tragedy of the Shoah. But on the other hand, I think that the political system in Israel, which is based on proportional elections, and as a consequence produces a parliament in which you have a very small majority. In fact, you have many parties. The present government by Netanyahu has a majority of one vote. It has 61 in favor of the government and 59 against in the opposition. The very bad consequence of such a constitutional arrangement is that you give an enormous power to the most extreme politicians. Because within the 61 that support the Netanyahu government, there are many who are reasonable. But there are a few who are, in my opinion, again, unreasonable. They just want to expand Israel, eliminate all expand the settlements and so on and so forth. And they can influence the government in an essential way, because the government, it's enough that one parliamentarian threatens to vote against the government, would fall. And this is a tragedy, in my opinion, in the opinion of someone who hopes that Israel will survive, because it seems to me that because of this, Israel is pushed to a kind of a suicidal policy. I hope it will change.
Thank you very much for the presentation. The one question is, how do we know that the countries which don't have nuclear weapons doesn't buy from others nuclear weapons? And are we sure, or do we have estimate if nuclear weapons are used after Hiroshima and Nagasaki? How we know that they are not used in general in wars, even today in Syria or other place?
Well, we know because it is possible to know. I mean, nuclear weapons, about having been used, nuclear weapons have a very distinct signature, essentially because they produce radiation. Other weapons don't produce radiation, and therefore it is possible to be sure that when they are used, not only when they use nuclear weapons, but also there is a very large capability of detection for nuclear tests, even when the tests are made underground.
Yes.
There is, you know, I mentioned the treaty. Yes, I shouldn't. I mentioned the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is not yet into force. However, when the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was signed, a mechanism was set in motion which produced something that I think is called provisional secretariat, something that looks very provisional, but that secretariat had the task to begin to organize the verification capability of a test ban treaty, namely the verification, not only countries don't have nuclear weapons, but they don't make nuclear tests, which is the first step towards acquisition of nuclear weapons. And this secretariat has been developed extremely efficiently so that now already exists, even though the treaty is not yet in force, there exists an institution which has a very developed system of worldwide coverage by many different techniques, seismic, satellites, measurements of radioactivity, so that this institution now is very capable to identify nuclear weapon explosions, even clandestine, even underground. And in fact, it has acquired certain capabilities. For instance, it's the best institution to monitor tsunamis, because they have satellites and they can see what happens in the seas. So this has been a very positive development, and certainly it is quite excluded that nuclear weapons can be used without being discovered.
Yes, I understood all this, and I know this, but perhaps the conclusions of measurements are not published because of diplomatic reasons. And for example, independent researchers which go to the places of Gulf War in 1991 or in the War of Serbia in 1999, they said that they had found radiation because of the using of nuclear weapons. So perhaps for diplomatic reasons it is not published, but they are used.
Look, if you believe in conspiracy theories, you can, think that, anything. Don't believe in conspiracy theory. Believe in, what is well known to the universal majority of people.
And one more short question. How big is and profitable is the nuclear industry in the general industry of weapons?
No, the nuclear industry has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. I mean, it has to do in the sense that it can produce materials that could be used. But the nuclear industry is an industry to produce electricity. And it does its job of producing electricity. And there is an institution, which is the IAEA, the international agency, which supervises in the whole world the nuclear industry to make sure that there are no diversions towards the constructions of nuclear weapons in any of the countries that have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and now also in the countries that are nuclear weapon countries that have submitted their peaceful activities to the IAEA. Of course, if you believe that the IAEA is, in the hands of Spectre, then, this is movies, not politics.
Again, thank you, sir. It's been a real privilege to sit and listen to you this evening. A couple of questions. One, I think, with a short and tragic answer, and another one. Since 1940, how much would you estimate has been spent globally on nuclear weapons? And the second question is, if tactical and nuclear weapons were based in South Korea and Japan, do you think that that would be a stabilizing or a destabilizing influence on the current situation with North Korea?
So the first question, I cannot, give the figures out of my head, but these figures are more or less known. There was for a long time in the world and in the United States the idea that nuclear weapons were in fact cheap. It was a big bang for little money. In fact, it is not true that they have been cheap. I mean, if one looks at the cost of nuclear weapon arsenals for the various countries that have acquired nuclear weapons, the United States, France, and England. I don't mention the Soviet Union because it's more opaque there, but there also. The cost has been very substantial. And there is a hidden cost in the elimination of the waste associated with the production of nuclear weapons, which is probably enormous. I don't have the figures, but I think the cost has been quite big, the cost of developing nuclear weapons, and the projection of, unfortunately, accepted by the Obama administration, of the investment in the next 30 years in the preservation or modernization of the nuclear weapon arsenal of the United States involve huge sums. Very, very large sums. That was the first question. So the second question was, say one word to remind me, because I'm old, I forget. Yes. Well, there were, nuclear weapons in South Korea, and then they were eventually withdrawn. I don't think that putting these weapons in South Korea, and much less in Japan, would be a stabilizing development. I don't believe that you can imagine, sort of a deterrence. You can imagine a deterrent situation in the sense that it is clear now that if ever North Korea should attack South Korea with nuclear weapons, North Korea would be completely obliterated, would disappear, because there are the nuclear weapons of the United States, and you don't have to have tactical nuclear weapons there. So I don't think that this would be a positive development, and I think that almost nobody suggests going in that direction. Some always will suggest this, but I think that it is not, I hope not to be shown wrong, but I don't think the Trump administration will go in that direction. In Japan, of course, that would be, Japan has a policy of anti-nuclear weapon. Because of their experience, time has gone by. The new government now is more edging, but still is a country. The two countries in the world that are more anti-nuclear weapons are, for obvious reasons, Japan, because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the other one is Kazakhstan, because of the nuclear weapon tests done in the Soviet Union in Kazakhstan, which were produced terrible consequences for many, many people in Kazakhstan. So they are a very anti-nuclear weapon country, I think, by very large public opinion. Of course, the regime there is a regime with a strong leader, but the strong leader understands that a policy being strongly anti-nuclear weapons has a strong support in the people, and so this is what they do, and this is probably the motivation for this development I mentioned it, of becoming the seat of this low-enriched uranium bank.
Thank you very much for the lecture. You mentioned several times during your presentation the efforts of President Obama to create a nuclear-free world, nuclear weapon-free world. And I was wondering how you foresaw the impact of the change of leadership in the United States, given their important role in this conversation.
No, the last part of your question I didn't understand. I am a bit deaf.
I talk quickly. So what do you foresee the impact of the change in leadership from President Obama to President Trump on the future of this conversation and the idea of a nuclear weapon-free world?
Well, yeah, this is a very good last question, because I will tell you something that I have also written. When President Reagan became president, Reagan had a tradition of being a very conservative politician in the United States, and certainly not a peacenik, in fact, the image of the cowboy and so on. But when he became president and realized what nuclear weapons are and the responsibility he would have to decide to use nuclear weapons, I think, and I'm not the only one to think, that he realized that this was a crazy situation, that one should go out of this. And he decided to go out by two routes. One which seems the more reasonable, to say not deterrence, but defense is the thing to do. And he was convinced by some scientists that it was possible. Unfortunately, it was not possible, and it was only a way to stimulate the arms race. But nevertheless, he went this way, SDI and so on. And the other one was to say, well, we must find an agreement with the other side. And that produced the meeting with Gorbachev and the final statement, that a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore should not be fought. So steps in the direction. And he would probably have agreed with Gorbachev to go towards the elimination of nuclear weapons if he was not convinced by his people around him that no, SDI was the real way and so on. So that was Reagan. And probably the motivation was because he arrived there by not having been involved in the philosophy, I call it theology, of nuclear weapons. Trump may be the same. Trump has not been involved, I think, throughout his life in thinking about the nuclear strategy, what to do with nuclear weapons, deterrence, and so on. So he has arrived there. He is now has to be confronted with the decision that as President of the United States, he might have to decide within 15 minutes to launch missiles with nuclear weapons. And that must be felt by any person as a terrible, terrible situation. Responsibility, but very, very, very unpleasant situation. So it is conceivable that Trump might make much more bold progress towards the elimination of nuclear weapons than any previous president. It is conceivable. It is wishful thinking on my part. But I think it is not to be excluded. And that, of course, also fits with this unpredictability in terms of standard politics. So this is my reply about the difference between Obama and Trump. Of course, I feel much more close to Obama because I think Obama was an admirable personality and full of good intentions. But it might be that Trump will do something that will surprise everybody in a positive direction. It might be. I'm glad to. I'm glad to end on a positive note.